All right, welcome back. This is part 2 of the week 10 lecture. One passage that isn't directly connected to what we're talking about, but I just thought it was interesting and cool, and again, very different from what we're accustomed to, I think, as American readers. If you guys turn to page 112 and it kind of spills over to the next page, we have an interesting depiction here of urban warfare. In the streets of Mexico City, we get this account of a pitched battle between the Spanish and the Native Americans. So this is, again, interesting at this point. And remember, by now, some of the Tlaxcalans are fighting, I believe, alongside... Well, now, at this point, I'm confused. No, I think the Tlaxcalans are with the Spanish at this point, fighting against the Aztecs. But we have depictions of catapults. We have, again, urban warfare in a sense that we might not often associate with American conquest. We might not associate this kind of warfare with the 16th century in sort of pre-Columbian civilizations. But again, as we saw last time, Tlaxcala and Mexico City were very urban spaces. And a lot of these nations in the central part of Mexico were urban dwellers. Right? They had, established seats of government. They had large population centers, pretty advanced in terms of architecture and infrastructure. Again, we might associate this stuff more with other cultures that come later in history, but we see it here. And this is all very much based on the real history of this conflict and these peoples. So, yeah, that's just kind of interesting. And oftentimes, as we mentioned last time, he's cribbing a lot of his info from an actual work of history by De Solis, which gets, cited quite a bit. You should see those footnotes. So he's taking text directly from that work of history about the conquest of Mexico. In some cases, he's taking some of the historians' words and putting them in the mouths of characters. At other times, he just uses descriptions of events. But one thing that I think limits the effectiveness of the book, and I want you guys to try to notice this, is oftentimes our author will summarize events rather than really depict them in a great amount of detail. He doesn't really directly depict a lot of the battles, a lot of the pivotal scenes in the course of the conquest. And again, there could be a lot of reasons for that. He's borrowing very heavily from history, and that's how a lot of history would have been written, kind of in more summary form. Again, without eyewitness accounts and without sort of survivors, it would have been difficult to kind of recreate the blow-by-blow accounts of these battles. So you have a lot of summary, but that can also be a byproduct of this author perhaps not being a professional fiction writer by trade. He's obviously very influenced by a lot of European lit, clearly very well read, but there could be, I wouldn't call it a novice quality, but just, maybe somebody who hadn't necessarily mastered the novel form as we would think of it. Again, this doesn't quite track as a modern novel. Again, it's very neoclassical. At times, it almost seems like a sort of like dialogue, almost like a sort of platonic dialogue with like two characters just talking a lot and sort of expounding on different views and morality and religion. The plot doesn't have great forward momentum. We don't always get the detail in all the places that we would expect. I would argue character development might be lacking at times, kind of perhaps not always three-dimensional characters. But in other ways, I do think there are modern aspects here. I think there are sort of aspects of a modern novel sort of peeking out from underneath this sort of formal, old-fashioned, neoclassical style that might seem a little strange to modern readers. But I want to go back to the idea of native virtue described in sort of European terms. So I wrote down a few examples of this. I want you guys to find some of these and kind of decide what you make of them. So there's one, this is kind of what I was talking about, like these sort of extended scenes of dialogue that aren't super dynamic. They're mostly just two characters sort of going back and forth, but each character has these long blocks of dialogue. But we have an interesting scene like this on page 94 between the priest, Olmedo, and the elder X. This, like, very genteel statesman who's depicted as very kind of progressive or modern, for his time period, and enlightened and sophisticated and a good sort of steward of his nation. But at this point, the priest is trying to convert him to Catholicism, and the elder X isn't super receptive. But we do have this moment where he's kind of trying to understand, because again, this pops up in a lot of conquest narratives, this idea that the Native Americans would have viewed conversion, at least initially, with a great deal of skepticism, at least in part, because the people professing to be Christian were killing them and committing all of these outrages, these moral depredations that did not seem in line with their actual teaching. So the Native Americans immediately sort of perceived the hypocrisy in what a lot of the Spanish were doing. And again, this is not unique to the Spanish, but just at this particular time period, they were the first Europeans to really be engaged in this level of warfare and conquest. It would happen with, the British and the French would do a lot of the same stuff a little later, Portuguese as well. But the Spanish were doing it here in the early 1500s, and I lost my train of thought. So this passage, just a bit of dialogue from the elder X talking to the priest. He says, "You are whiter than we are. You have a beard and other differences, which seemingly make you a man from a species other than ours. Nevertheless, your morality is the same as mine. Thus, it comes from God." So what we have here, they disagree on a lot of things, but the common ground, they both kind of agree on this basic conception of God as this kind of omnipotent, relatively, they think, kind of benign, all-powerful force. So they can kind of agree on this monotheistic conception of what God is. And again, there's common ground here. Olmedo's not a bad guy. He's not developed all that much, but he's kind of presented along with Ordaz. Ordaz is the true representative of virtue amongst the Spanish, but Olmedo's okay. He doesn't do anything bad. He's just kind of quiet and a conformist. He doesn't really question the Spanish mission the way Ordaz does. But this is an interesting exchange between the two, because at one point, I think Olmedo even calls him stubborn or obstinate. The elder X is not really accepting all the doctrine, all of the rules. And again, he's really suspicious of the messenger. He's like, well, if you guys are Christians, that doesn't speak great to the values of Christianity. And if you guys, if you know Bartolomeo de las Casas, we read the destruction of the Indies in 451. That's another text that might even get referenced in here at one point. There's a footnote, I think, that references de las Casas. I think our author quotes de las Casas, who was a real Spanish priest who was mostly in the Caribbean and wrote a very detailed account of what we see here: destruction, warfare, rape, pillage, murder. The Spanish basically massacring Native Americans in the modern-day Dominican Republic and Cuba. But he has scenes similar in his narrative where Native Americans are sort of given the chance to convert, and they basically say, why would I want to associate with Christianity if you guys are representatives of Christianity? I want nothing to do with your religion. So that's kind of a familiar, it's almost a trope in conquest narratives, to kind of try to navigate this tricky process of conversion, which a lot of Native Americans simply didn't want to do for the reasons that we can obviously understand. But often, like in De las Casas and in other conquest narratives, there would be sort of a follow-up provided by the author or narrator where they would kind of clarify for the reader that, well, the Native Americans just didn't really understand Christianity very well. And they might, in the case of De las Casas, who was very critical of his countrymen, there might be an acknowledgement that, yeah, these conquistadors, these Spaniards that came over and did all these terrible things, they're not great representatives of the church. They're not true Christians. They might have claimed to be, but they're not. So they did set a bad example. So there'd be an acknowledgement of that, but there'd also be this larger sense that, if Native Americans just saw real Christians, good Christians, then they would easily, be convinced. And again, that's kind of what we get in Ralston, right? The Native American characters are very eager in that novel to convert to Christianity. They don't really have to be, persuaded or, forced, which was the reality most of the time. But here we don't really get that. We don't get maybe the expected pushback against the Elder X's views, because he's kind of dismissing Christianity to the point where even Olmedo can't quite win him over in maybe the way that we would expect. And again, Olmedo's not really a bad Christian, but even his presence and his arguments don't fully persuade. But again, we're supposed to see some common ground, that these two virtuous people can at least agree on basic concepts concerning God. So this is a recurring theme, or just sort of a recurring move that the author makes. I'm not sure that I would call it a theme, but it might be. But what he often wants to do is what other authors that we've seen have done. Take virtuous Native Americans and compare them to, virtuous Europeans, or to show that their belief system is similar to the belief system of virtuous Europeans. So in Ralston, at least in Volume 1, when she did depict Native Americans somewhat favorably, one of her favorite methods was to compare the good Native Americans with Europeans, right? They're similar. They have similar values. They're very quick to adopt European ways. That just shows that we have a lot in common, and that's why they're the good kind. Then in Volume 2, she stops doing that, and she focuses more on the bad kind who aren't so eager to adopt European ways. So there might be some shades of that in what we see here, but again, it's more complicated here. Certainly, we're occupying more of a Native American perspective, but again, we do have these certain European values. So I've already mentioned the honor, the thread of honor that we can track here. So yeah, this is at the very beginning of Book 5 on page 105. That's the scene where young X sees Tutela and Ordaz and immediately thinks that they're running around together. So again, that's a very Spanish conception of honor. A little bit weird to put that in a Native American character, but again, look at how it plays out. Look at how Tutela is eventually exonerated. And young X has to really kind of ask forgiveness. It's one of the few bad things he does. He's depicted as so virtuous, such a strong, morally upstanding character. One of the few kind of moments of weakness for him is when he suspects his wife, when he's kind of led astray by perhaps an old-fashioned conception of honor. And maybe that's the point, right? Like I said in part 1, maybe the author wants us to realize that that old ideal of honor, just like all of these other old conceptions from Europe, they don't have any place in a new land, in a new republic or a new country, a new nation, which Mexico at this time was in the 1820s. So again, just kind of play around with that. But there's some other interesting moves that are kind of similar to this. So if you look over on page 109, for example, was this one on? This is really more. The bottom of 110 is where I want. Oh yeah. So again, this is interesting again because this goes back to kind of the slight conflict between the real historical reality of the Tlaxcalans and the narrative that we're getting here. So at the bottom of 110, this is young X speaking. He says that, the Spanish are trying to destroy our religion. We cannot deny the fact that they are attempting to alter our laws and our form of government. They are transforming the venerable republic of the Tlaxcalans into a monarchy and turning us into subjects under the detested dominion of emperors, a yoke that is so heavy and violent, even when it is seen around the neck of our enemies. It hurts to even consider the matter. So again, we're supposed to think of this as what a freedom-loving Mexican citizen in the 1820s would also say. Forget emperors, forget monarchies, forget Europe. Let's do our own thing. But of course, it's happening in reverse now. The Tlaxcalans already had the Republican-style government and freedom and autonomy, and now they feel like they're losing it. And obviously, to a large extent, they did lose a lot of their cultural distinctiveness. They did lose their religion over time. They lost other parts of their culture and society, but for about 300 years, up until Mexico became independent, up until around, I think, 1824, according to my notes, Tlaxcala remained separate from the rest of that part of Spanish America. New Spain was what Mexico was originally called. Tlaxcala was separate. The Tlaxcalans were allowed to govern themselves. Now, obviously, they still had to answer to the Spanish government. They couldn't just do whatever they wanted. And if they ever tried to rise up and revolt, they would have been put down with great violence, no doubt. But they were allowed a certain degree of autonomy. Again, just remember that. But that would kind of get in the way. Those facts would kind of get in the way, I think, of the larger sort of narrative arc that we're dealing with here, and the larger point that the author's trying to make about Spanish conquest. And I don't want to overstate the Tlaxcalans' autonomy. It wasn't what it once was, right? They did not go back to their sort of pre-Columbian state of being. They were still altered. And again, over time, they lost their religion. They lost a lot of their cultural distinctiveness. But it really wasn't until the 1820s and an independent Mexico came on the scene that they were fully integrated back into the larger nation. So in 1824, Tlaxcala became a federal territory of Mexico, almost exactly 300 years after they cut that deal with the Spanish to kind of remain somewhat separate. So it's a little complex, but again, the larger point, of course, that applies to really all the Native American inhabitants of central Mexico is yes, their way of life as they once knew it is over. Their systems of government are largely over, or at least compromised. Their native customs, traditions, their language, all of these things are obviously either directly taken away from this by the Spanish, or they will fade over time. So that's the larger point. But again, notice how the author makes it. And as part of the process of showing the virtue of a Native American character, he's comparing that Native American to, if not European values, at least sort of what we might think of as democratic or Republican, sort of freedom-loving values that were certainly in currency amongst the former Spanish colonies and the former British colonies. Remember, we're only about 50 years removed from the American Revolution. And this guy published the book in Philadelphia. So there's all this resonance with American independence, the independence of Spanish American nations, and this belief in a different system of government, freeing yourself, from the control of European empires and kings. Again, that would all have really landed clearly with readers in the 1820s, even American readers, even though this is a different part of the Americas, a slightly different history. There's still that similar, sort of movement towards more modern governments, more modern societies, breaking free from European rules. So there's all these weird parallels that we have to track. And again, the Tlaxcalans were doing all of that while the Europeans were not. But if we follow the thread and think about them as modern, we almost can't help but eventually compare them to Mexican citizens or American citizens, U.S. citizens in the 1820s. But another example of kind of how this comparing maneuver often works, over on page 117, just another example, comparing young X to Brutus, another Republican, little r Republican. This generous and valiant American was planning a noble vengeance, one worthy of a Republican spirit. Like another Brutus, he swore that he would see the tyrant dead. So again, this is common, right? We're comparing young X to a famous European character from history, but also primarily, in our experience, from literature, right? So we mostly know Brutus as a part of the Julius Caesar saga as handed down from Shakespeare, who wrote the famous play. Of course, Brutus was probably a real person. Julius Caesar certainly was. But we mostly remember these characters from Shakespeare's sort of rendition. And I always think of Brutus as Marlon Brando, because that's who played him in the 1960s movie version of Shakespeare's play of the life of Julius Caesar. So this is getting kind of overly complicated, but the point is Brutus is a European model that we can compare to young X in terms of their virtue, their strength, their actions, and their belief in a more modern, sort of enlightened style of government in the face of tyranny and despots and, monarchy. So what does it mean that we still fall back on these European models? Does that lessen the impact of these favorable depictions of the Native Americans, or do we see it working in a different way? Do we see, perhaps these comparisons don't privilege the Europeans? Maybe we're just invited to appreciate the shared virtue. Again, focus on the common ground. Between the elder X and the priest, the common ground between the younger X and a figure from Roman history, to see that certain upstanding or sort of certain morals, certain virtues are perhaps universal, or they stand the test of time, or this idea that maybe this narrative has kind of played out at other times and other places in somewhat similar ways. But again, as we learned at the very beginning, this conquest is different than all earlier conquests because of the scope, because of the scale, and frankly, because of the brutality, which is also probably on a bigger scale. But we can still find these precedents in European history. But again, we want to compare the author wants us to compare the Native American characters to European characters, but that kind of runs both ways, I think, in weird ways. But again, remember, neoclassicism would celebrate republican government, patriotism, valor. Those were things that were celebrated by ancient Greeks and Romans as well. So we're kind of celebrating those classic virtues, but we're finding them in a place where many Europeans would not have expected them to exist. And many Americans many U.S. citizens might not have expected those kinds of virtues, this kind of government, these kinds of characters to exist in central Mexico at the time of Cortez and the Spanish invasion. So hopefully that makes sense. And then I just wanted to briefly touch on religion. Again, kind of an interesting treatment of Catholicism. If we look on page 120, and then a little bit later towards the end of the narrative, the character who seems to have a lot to say about religion is Doña Marina, who we talked about a little bit last week. And as Castillo-Falou says in the intro, she is kind of an interesting character. She has more depth and complexity than I think most other characters in our cast. She starts out as kind of immoral, all right? She's kind of duplicitous. She's the concubine and confidant of Cortez. She has a kind of weird sexual encounter with Ordaz that doesn't really end well. He kind of rejects her. She ends up getting pregnant with Cortez's baby, but then she converts to Christianity. But here on page 120, she's sort of rejecting the teachings of Christianity, and it's really kind of an anti-Catholic passage. If you look at the bottom of 120, kind of going over to the next page, and again, there's not any real immediate pushback from the narrator or the author. Her words are kind of allowed to stand. And again, the priest kind of has a response for her, but then she keeps going. And then she kind of turns her attention, I think, eventually they kind of turned to Cortez and other examples of sort of hypocrisy and the falseness of this faith. But even later, on at the very end, this is like the ending's really weird. I actually just want to go ahead and jump to the ending now, and we can wrap up here. This is weird. When I read this book for the first time, I expected more of a clear resolution. Again, we know what happens, but historically speaking. But there's this weird treatment of religion as the priest is yet again sort of unsuccessful in his attempts to, in this case, he's not trying to convert somebody, but he's trying to kind of get through to Cortez. And he kind of, because remember, Totila was going to kill Cortez, and the priest tries to tell him that, God had intervened to save him from her dagger. And that with this intervention, divine providence was warning him that his life was in danger, just like anybody else's could be. Thus, he should redouble his zealous faith in God and change his behavior to concur with his holy commandments. So that all makes sense. That's what we would think the priest would say, and it all tracks. But if this was Rowson, or if this was another conquest narrative, particularly produced by an Anglo-American author, Cortez would have a change of heart, right? He really would reform. He would say, oh man, I see the error in my ways. I want to get in touch with God. I want to reform my conduct. You're right, Father. Let me start my reformation. Let me start my redemption. But that's not what happens here. This speech had exactly the opposite effect that the good friar had intended, because it smothered the sparks of tender sensitivity that Marina had lit in the heart of Cortez a little bit earlier, and he, Cortez, recovering his usual superiority and serenity, stood up, saying, "Let's be done with this, friends." And I'll just move on. Essentially, he's saying, let's keep marching to topple the Aztec Empire. But look at the anachronism at the very end. Cortez says, and again, the final words are Cortez's, which I think is kind of appropriate. Of course, by now, most of our main Native American characters are dead. So this is kind of symbolic of how this narrative ends, right? Cortez kind of is the last man standing. So it's kind of appropriate that we end with him. And he says, perhaps it is sweeter to live a tranquil and peaceful life somewhere, but that is not my destiny. Tomorrow, we leave for Mexico City. And as you can see that footnote, they're referring to the Aztec capital city, which at the time would have been known as Tenochtitlan. They're referring to it by its modern day name, Mexico City. So again, that to me is very deliberate. I think that's a very explicit attempt to connect these events of the past to the 1820s, the present tense in terms of when this book was published. Another link between the events of the 1520s to the events of the 1820s, to use the modern name there and to put the modern name in Cortez's mouth, just like referring to the Aztecs as Mexicans and referring to many of the Native Americans as Americans. Again, kind of using modern terminology. That's a bit anachronistic, but I think it's done very deliberately here to help the anonymous author kind of deliver this larger message, whatever you think. I think it has something to do with freedom, the battle against oppression, the battle against tyranny, whether that's represented by Cortez and his conquistadors in the 1500s, or the decaying, crumbling Spanish Empire of the early 1800s. So there's a lot of commonalities and connections that I think are being established here. So some of the final questions we need to answer, we need to kind of go back to this notion of a hemispheric history and what it does for us. I saw that a couple of you were sort of dealing with this in our week 9 discussion, when you were talking about, kind of what we can gain from a hemispheric history. And yeah, some of you are touching on the fact that this is a more accurate, a more truthful representation of that history. But I also just want us to think about commonalities between the U.S. and Mexico. Or if we want to think about it like British America and Spanish America. as we know, slightly different histories, slightly different trajectories, but obviously a lot of commonalities in terms of, the destruction of Native Americans, the conquest of land, the imposition of European government, European culture, European society, European style institutions on the New World, on the Americas. All of that tracks no matter where in the Americas we are. Canada, the US, Mexico, the Caribbean, South America. Similar things were playing out in all of those places over the course between the 1500s and the 1800s. So what can we do with that? What's the value of learning more about that and knowing more about that as U.S. citizens? What does that do for us? And do we need more work like this one? Do we need more of these kinds of historical, these kinds of works of historical fiction to give us a more accurate portrait and perhaps a more unifying portrait of the Americas? And again, I think we can see that Rowson had some similar impulses, but she doesn't execute it in the way that it's executed here. And, again, we can try to figure out some of those reasons. Again, why is this particular author taking a different approach to similar subject matter? Why is he presenting the conquest in such different ways? Again, it has a lot to do with the 1820s and the struggles for independence, but what could be some other factors? What could be some other reasons that he's giving us this kind of alternative history? And then also, again, not that might be a misleading term. I mean, it's more of the real history, but it kind of sometimes registers as alternative if it's not what we're accustomed to. And then finally, fusion. I want to return to the idea of cultural fusion, sort of synthesis, combining the best of different cultures. We talked a lot about that in relation to Reuben and Rachel, and we said that that was something Rowson was trying to do, especially with the character of Columbia Arundel. She brought together noble strains of European blood and Inca blood, and she was a descendant of Columbus, but she also had a certain degree of Native American identity. And we kind of talked about how maybe Columbia was supposed to represent this kind of more inclusive sort of vision of what America could be. But of course, Rowson kind of goes back on that in Volume 2. She drops that whole mission in favor of a much more conventional, sort of Anglo-focused narrative, all the way to the point where Reuben, who has Native American blood of his own, is almost never described as partially Native American. He rejects Native American culture. He has no use for it, even though that is part of his own heritage. So it's almost like Rowson has this idea, but she didn't stick with it. And I'm always fascinated by that. Why does she abandon that sort of fusion model? Why does she abandon it for something that seems a lot less inclusive and a lot more sort of white supremacy? But that's Reuben and Rachel. What we're seeing here, could this be a more legitimate kind of fusion? Not so much because we have a lot of intermarriage. We're not seeing that like we saw in Reuben and Rachel. But again, there's this cultural there are these cultural parallels or these moral parallels that the author establishes between certain Native American characters and sort of the best parts or the best representatives of European culture, Spanish culture, like Ordaz. Maybe some of what the priest offers through Catholicism, right? So again, that mission of making these Native Americans sort of seem like contemporary Mexican citizens in certain ways. So maybe there's a weird kind of fusion being achieved here. It's not being done the same way that it's being done in Rowson's work. Maybe it's better here. It's certainly different. But do we end up with some kind of cultural hybrid that brings together Native Americans and Europeans in ways that could maybe work for modern audiences? I want to leave you guys with that question. You guys answer it. In fact, that's probably going to be our main discussion question for this week. I don't have any better ones. So let's ponder that and finish up the book by the end of this week. Next week, we start on Hope Leslie. So we go back to the U.S., similar time period, somewhat similar subject matter, but the perspective will change and the vision of history will change. We're going to Puritan New England, but we are experiencing Native American culture and early European conquest, just in a different way. So hopefully that book opens up some more discussion. It's longer, it's a little denser, and it's going to take us a little bit longer to get through it perhaps, but we are just spending 2 weeks. So if you need a little extra time, let's talk. And if you finish, if you finish Young X relatively early, go ahead and jump into Hope Leslie, and we'll talk about Sedgwick, our author, and the book next week. We'll have 2 lectures on it, and I'll get us started next week. See you then.